Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for sticking around, and you've made it to the end. This is it. This is the final panel, and we have the great task of wrapping up everything that we've heard this week with our session on global power constellations and how they've changed. When they asked me to do this panel, I looked at the lineup and I was a little worried at first that we've got a pretty diverse group of a congressman, a minister from Europe, someone from the energy sector. But as I spoke to them, I think you'll see it's a great mix, and it shows a lot of what we've learned this week. I don't know about you, but one of the things I've heard often is how maybe because of Trump in the United States, because of Brexit, there's a lot less trust or desire to work with heads of state. There's a lot less interest or belief that that's going to get to the ends that lots of people want for their issues. But underneath that, there are a lot of other networks, lots of other ways that people are connecting with each other, using current systems, thinking of new systems, new ideas. So hopefully we'll hear a lot of that from our panels. I don't want to do any more talking, and we'll let them do the talking. And then we'll get to you guys. And I want you to be thinking of not just questions about what we're talking about, but also about the entire week. We're at the end now, about what you've heard. And as GMF wants us to do this year, about the solutions. What are the action steps that need to happen going forward? So without further ado, we'll bring our panel out, please. Thank you. Please, whoever would like to sit. Well, I'll give the introductions. I thought we were going to hear them, but I'll do it for us instead. From our host nation, from Belgium, we have the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs and European Affairs, Minister Reinders. Over here we have from the great state of New York, from Queens, Congressman Gregory Meeks, who assures us he is a Mets fan. That is his district, and so is JFK Airport. So if you have any flight delays, bring it up with him. And finally, from BP, Chief Executive Officer for Alternative Energy and Executive Vice President for Europe and Asia regions, Dev Sanyal. Thank you all for coming. Mr. Minister, let's go to you first, since this is your country. We are the host nation. I hear, as an American, when I come over here, a lot of talk. This is a very Eurocentric forum, and it's a different conversation than we have in Washington, and it's a different conversation from the national security scene in Washington that I cover as a defense reporter. There are a lot of other ways that we measure power, and a lot of other ways or concerns about how it's shifting in the balance. So start us off about your thoughts of what you think of when we think of the theme of this topic. About the changing balance of power.
So first of all, I want to say that there is some possible remarks about the change in the repartition of the global powers. The first element I want to say that since many years we are speaking all the time about emerging countries. So it's not a surprise that they are emerging. And so we have seen now a real role for China. We have maybe some different kind of activities coming from Russia, but it's normal because it's not new that we have seen that. The second element is in a long-term perspective. The multilateral approach is going up all the time. Of course, century after century. It was all the time after a war that it was possible to start something. I don't want to go back to the 17th century and the Treaty of Westphalia, but also in the 19th century in Vienna. And then after the First World War, and it was another president in the US, with the President Wilson, with the 14 points, it was possible to start the League of Nations and to do something till the Second World War. And it's just after the Second World War that we will start again a multilateral process with the United Nations as with many other organizations. That's the second point. So on the long-term perspective, we are going up with the multilateral approach. But maybe for the moment, we are going down. And as a third element, I've seen the evolutions in different fields. In security field, we are in a huge difficulty when we try to discuss about the situation in Syria. We have all the time a veto coming from Russia. But when we discuss about the climate change, we have seen it was possible for the new US administration to say that it's possible to go out of the Paris Agreement. We have some difficulties in the implementation of the nuclear deal with Iran, the JCPOA. Now we have a trade problem with such decision to impose some tariffs of steel and aluminum. It's quite difficult to understand that. And so it's my third remark. If we have such an evolution, it's maybe time for other kind of actors to play a bigger role. Certainly for China, we don't have exactly the same values, but also for the European Union. And the European Union needs to deliver at home, to do more in security and defense, to do more in foreign affairs policy and in some other issues, the economic and monetary union, but maybe also in the global vision of the world, we need to be more present in different fields. And why not, in such a situation, a more regional approach? We have such an expertise in Europe to have a regional integration, and it's possible to discuss maybe with, not only with Africa, we are doing that all the time, but also with Latin America, with Asia, with different kind of regions in the world, from one region to another one. I'm not speaking about the reform of the Security Council on a regional basis, that's maybe for later, but at least for the moment, to try to have other kind of relations with different partners. And to be concrete, some years ago, we have tried to discuss the TTIP with the US administration. Now we see such a decision to impose new tariffs. So it's time for the European Union to be ready to discuss with the Mercosur, with Mexico, with Japan, with Vietnam, with all the different partners in the world, also China, to conclude different kind of other free trade agreements on all the different possibilities that we have. And just to say a last word, of course, Belgium is very committed to a multilateral approach. It's the reason why we try to stay in many different organizations. We'll organize a new NATO summit in July in Brussels. We are a candidate for the Security Council for 2019 and 2020 because we are convinced that we have a role to play, like many other actors in the Security Council in the next years. But again, with such a new organization of the repartition of power in the world, it's maybe important to think about a regional approach. We have such a capacity in Europe, but there are some positive evolutions in Asia. There are some positive evolution in some part of Africa on that, in Latin America. So if it's needed, we will maybe discuss from one region to another one. And that is maybe a message coming from the European Union because we have the expertise to do that. And the last word about the private sector, but not only the private sector. I will want to go back to the climate change agreement, the agreement in Paris, the COP21. Also with such an hesitation, to use a diplomatic word, in the new US administration, it's maybe possible to go further with some states in the US, but also with the private sector. I'm sure that there are many companies in the US asking to do more in renewable energy, energy efficiency, and in many other fields, because there is a real market in the world about that. So also with a real hesitation of the new US administration, we have the capacity to work in the US with some states, but maybe also with many companies able to go further in the fight against climate change with all the other partners. So just to say that about the private sector, but there are people more involved in the private sector than myself, maybe in the panel.
Thank you, and we will hear from the others. I will say I was remiss, I forgot to look to our word cloud on the screens, if it's possible to throw that back up. There it is, thank you. So this is, get out your phones, this is the fun part. Before we hear other speakers and plant ideas in your heads, I wanted to get you a little bit more raw. When you think of global power, who or what is on the rise? We've heard a lot of ideas about, like I said, other than heads of state talking to each other, even perhaps other than the EU, maybe it's the EU. China, we see, no surprise, Russia, populism. That's an interesting word I'd like to talk about again. That's one we just don't say very often back in the States. I think we call it Trumpism. Let's see, who else? Islam, multipolar, water, that's interesting. News is on the rise, good to know. Good to know, we get a raise. I need a journalist in the house for that. Okay, Congressman Meeks, how about while they're talking, maybe you can sneak in something at the end of the timer as it finishes up. We just heard the European view. EU was quickly mentioned, regional organizations, multilateral institutions. In your mind, when you think of the changing global power constellation, what's changing, who's on the rise, what's different, where are we headed? Give us your thoughts.
Thank you. Let me first thank Karen and the GMF because it's substantial. When I just sit around and look at the panel that we have here, you know, I attended once before, and I've got to just start off by saying this. I never witnessed a panel previously where you had a European, a black man, and a brown man sitting on a panel, and a woman who's heading it all. So to me, that is significant, and it makes a difference because it is the world in which we're currently living in. And when you're talking about a democracy, the question always comes, democracy for who? Is it for everyone, or is it just for some? And I think that's the question. That is some of the questions that we're having in the United States of America, and I think that's some of the questions that are taking place in Europe. Now, the constellations have definitely shifted. I have been in Washington, D.C. now as a member of Congress for 20 years. When I came into Washington 20 years ago, I said that, you know, we're living in a global economy. Things are going to get smaller for everyone, and we're going to be more interrelated. I had no idea of how small the world would get within those 20 years. With the greatest inventions and technology that I think that has ever happened in the human history has taken place within that time and has made this world so much smaller. So when I came in, I thought I was doing some innovative ideas because when I was a member of Congress on the Foreign Affairs Committee, I said, let me work, and I worked with one of my Republican colleagues and create the Russian caucus. Because I said we live now in a post-Cold War period. And we need to talk to Russia because I thought that they were moving toward being a more democratic society. I said, let's make sure that we engage with Turkey. Because at that time, Turkey was fighting and wanted to do the reforms that was necessary so that they could become a member of the EU. And I thought that we should also make sure that we made changes with China. So when I first came into Washington, one of the earliest votes that I had is whether or not we were going to have permanent and normal trade relations with China. Criticized by a lot of my colleagues when I voted for it. But here we are now, 20 years later. And I see China now wants to put in someone that wants to be president for life. I see Turkey no longer concerned whether or not they're doing the reforms that are necessary so they can become part of the EU. That's not their focus anymore. And they're going more to being an authoritarian society. And I see us in the United States and in Europe trying to decide whether or not we want to be inclusive or exclusive. Wow, has things changed in 20 years. So the questions that are going to present themselves is a democracy, and where do we go from here? Because the constellations have surely changed and turned around. So where do we go from here? For me, 20 years later, I thought the most important thing now was not having the Russian caucus anymore, not focused on Turkey to the degree that I was before, not focused on China the way that I was before. So I became the co-founder of the EU caucus. Because I think that today is more important than anything else. Why? Because the basic values that we share is important to give to others. If we're talking about the values where everybody can be included in the democracy. And that's significant. I close on this. Why is it significant? Well, when I listen to the people around the world talking, and you hear populism, and you hear China, and you hear, things are coming from all over the world, I think of me. In the United States of America, at times in debates on committees, I say this often. For me, in my lifetime, I am like some of those immigrants or migrants or refugees who are now trying to come to the United States or to Europe. So for me and my father, though others were saying there was democracy in America, there was not. We couldn't participate if you were black. You couldn't vote. You were given the worst of everything. You were last on the list. So was that democracy? No, it was not. But the reason why I believe that we need to be focused on the EU now, because the opportunity of democracy is what's everything. Because when we talk about in the United States, the civil rights movement, that was the movement, that was the challenge for America at that time. Were they going to allow people to participate or not? And I dare say that if the United States at that time prevented people of color from participating, we would not be where we are today. That's why I say oftentimes when you talk about Dr. King, he saved America. So the question is, and democracy, as a result, was preserved, and what I call the greatest experiment on this planet, which is the United States of America in this sense. You have Italians, you have Germans, you have Irish, you have English, you have people from all over the world coexisting, different languages, and trying to pull together. I think that's the key to a better tomorrow.
Thank you, sir, for that. Sure, that draws a round of applause. And the congressman, I haven't been in every panel this week, but I think he was right. I don't know that we've had any substantive discussion about race. We've heard about women, and we've heard about lots of other issues, people on the rise in this new era. So thanks for bringing that into the discussion, and I'm sure we'll hear more about it as we go on. Dev, so you're the representative from energy, BP, big energy, global energy. What's changing for your world? And feel free to take the floor as much as you want as far as, you know, we don't have to just hear about oil and gas. We can hear about anything. But you have some interesting ideas about consumers.
Well, terrific. Thank you very much for, first of all, being here on a Saturday morning at the fag end of this great conference. I have to say, when you look forward, you do need to reflect on where you've come from. I think Wayne Gretzky, the famous ice hockey player, once observed, you need to skate to where the puck is going to be, as opposed to where the puck has been. And as I look back over the last 50 years, there's a lot to be actually rather proud about, a lot to feel good about. When you take a big step back, if you look at the macro picture, life expectancy has basically increased from 50 years to 70 years globally. The global population has actually doubled. We've seen GDP grow 30-fold over that period, and extreme poverty has been halved. So on many measures, what are we complaining about and what are we worrying about? Well, of course, as we all know, in politics, in government, in civil society, and indeed in business, change is a constant. And dealing with ambiguity is the muscle you need to have, especially as you look forward. Because there are changes happening that have profound implications in terms of how we position ourselves as a business, how we think about demand, how we think about consumers, how we think about resources, and indeed, how we think about technology as enabling this future. So BP is a company that has also evolved over the last century. We started off as the Anglo-Persian oil company till we got nationalized in Persia, and we then became BP. And since then, of course, we have grown our business very substantially. We merged with Amoco and Arco and Weber in Germany. And we've also now got a strategy that is continuing to evolve. We're going to see a portfolio that's going to be gassier rather than oilier. We have today the world's largest operated renewables portfolio amongst the super majors. So there are many changes that are actually occurring in our own portfolio, mirroring the larger trends that we see. What I want to do today is basically talk about 5 things that are actually changing and we have to be thoughtful about as we position ourselves in the world that we are entering into. And I don't mean to sound alarmist, because I don't think there's a jagged edge here. There are these evolutions, as opposed to revolutions, that I think have profound consequence when you then look back over a 50-year time horizon, as we've done in the very beginning, as we thought about prosperity, population, and indeed poverty. The first is demand. So I joined the industry 29 years ago. after I graduated from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy with Karen, or the same graduating class. She was brighter than me. And at the time when I joined the industry, essentially 20% of demand was in the non-OECD. 80% was in the OECD. In 2010, it became roughly 50-50. Today, our forecast is for the next 20 years, for the next 2 decades, essentially 100% of the growth in demand is from the non-OECD. That's a profound shift. And by the way, we are forecasting essentially by 2030, the largest growth in terms of demand is not from China, it's from India. So we are seeing effectively a massive rebalancing where essentially the narrative is a very simple one. There is growing economic activity, growing prosperity in the non-OECD, and energy is an essential ingredient to fueling, pardon the pun, that prosperity. The second key shift that we are seeing is actually around resources. One of the things that is not often talked about is that 4 countries basically have 50% of the world's resources in gas, and 4 countries have 50% of the world's resources in oil. In gas, it's Iran, it's Qatar, it's Turkmenistan, and it is actually Russia. In oil, it's Iran again, Venezuela, Canada, and Saudi Arabia. Now think of it. The entire system was geared towards how do you supply the OECD. That system is now gearing to how do you supply the non-OECD as they power their economies. By the way, just to put in perspective, Europe has 0.3% of the world's reserves and around 13 to 14% of both demand for oil and gas. Trade is an essential ingredient to European success because energy is an essential ingredient to economic success. The third factor I want us to consider in this age of plenty is actually the role of the United States. And I call it the shale gale. I mean, essentially, in 2005, the US administration was forecasting that America would need to import this year 5 million barrels a day. America today is exporting. America this year could be the largest producer of oil in the world. We are seeing essentially a gas narrative which is being fueled by shale, and essentially you're seeing 20% growth in the last decade in terms of global gas. But as we look forward for the next 20 years, we see America providing 25% of the world's demand in terms of gas. That's a massive shift. An economy that is the largest in the world, which is very reliant on energy from other parts of the world, now has got actually its own energy self-sufficiency. Notice I use the word self-sufficiency, not independence, because I think interdependence is still important in the world of energy, and indeed, I think, in the global economic system.
Dev, I'll ask you for your last 2 points. You
Yep.
speed them up, we'll get the conversation going
and the
again.
final 2 points I'd make
Thanks.
very quickly, Kevin, is really around the role of renewables, which is referred to. We are seeing over the next 20 years a 699% growth in renewables. So the kind of energy that is going to be consumed is also shifting. And by the way, over the last decade, we saw around a 2.5% growth in emissions. Over the next decade, we see a 0.4% growth in emissions. So again, a big shift. And finally, a big shift in technology. Last year, we had one of our very young geologists develop an algorithm that enabled essentially us to discover a field within a field containing 200 million barrels of oil. That entire algorithm was developed in a fortnight. if it used 20th century computing power, it would have taken us 1,000 years to develop that same algorithm. So I think, in conclusion, really, what we are seeing in the world of energy is actually a metaphor of what we're seeing in the world. A relentless shift in terms of the growth, in terms of nation states that had not the same access to the prosperity we've enjoyed in the OECD. We are seeing different forms of energy and technology actually enabling extraordinary things that have some consequences that are both positive and indeed consequences that we need to be quite thoughtful about. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. So, okay, we heard a lot. We've heard technology and business sectors and race and migration and democracy itself and the EU and trade, multilaterals. Again, then there's probably many other ways other than nation states. And I thought of, Derek Chalet this morning came out to remind us of Bob Kagan's introductory remarks when he said this idea of the liberal international order of nation states is actually pretty new in our human history. It's the anomaly, it's the exception to the rule, and maybe we forgot how valuable or how precious or what it takes to keep that going, if that's what we want to keep going. So maybe let's try to blend some of these a little bit and go back to you, Mr. Minister. Again, my take on coming here to Brussels is I'm actually struck how much we talk about the EU because it's how little we talk about it in Washington. I can't find a headline where you hear about the EU. And it's not just because I'm a defense guy and I talk about NATO, but I said the same thing to the congressman, that there is a caucus on the EU. But he's focusing on ideas like migration and trying to be more inclusive and opening up democracies. That's not necessarily a given in either one of our societies. So what is the answer? Is it to continue these institutions like EU or any others, and strengthen them, or is there something new that needs to be done? And what does it matter in the context of this populist movement if the people aren't for it?
Yes, we have seen such a kind of populist movement in the last
Please.
elections in Europe, and it was starting maybe the presidential election in Austria, and then we have seen that in the Netherlands, in France, in Germany, now in Italy. Hopefully it was possible after the elections to try to put in place some governance more involved in the European process and maybe with a less populist approach. But we are receiving some signals of populism in different elections, and not only in the elections. If you are looking to the migration issue in Europe, we have huge discussions about that, because of course it's our duty to receive the refugees, but to share the responsibility and to share the capacity to receive those refugees is not so evident. And we are in discussion with certainly the eastern part of Europe about that. There are some resistance in the eastern part of Europe about the way to receive the refugees. But to go back to your question about the evolution, we need to deliver at home in Europe. We have two issues for the moment. One is the Brexit. Of course, we need to manage that and to have a smooth process if it's possible, and to stay in a close contact with the UK after the Brexit. But we need also to go deeper in the organization of the European Union. I said in the Economic and Monetary Union, it's possible to do more, maybe with the members of the Eurozone. It's possible to try to do more in defense and security, and we have started with the PESCO. It's a real progress in the European Union about the integration of our capacity in defense and security, and maybe to be more and more a European pillar in the NATO. So, because it's very important to stay with a very close transatlantic alliance. And of course, we need to make some progresses on migration and on all those difficult issues in the European Union. The second element is, if we are able to do that, it's not a model, but we have seen that it's also possible in other parts of the world to have some regional integrations. And it's the only one way to solve some conflicts. Without the regional integration, you are staying with many armed conflicts everywhere. And in Europe, it was to solve a war that it was possible to start the process. And I want just to add, of course, it's important to stay with some caucus about the US in Europe and maybe about the European Union in the US. Why? Because you're right, we try not only to share the same values, but to try to develop a process not to impose, but to share those values with others. And on such a point, it's also very important to deliver at home. To be concrete, in Europe for the moment, I've tried since more than 2 years to ask to organize a peer review every year not only about the budget, the economic process, but also the values about democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, in fact. And if you look to the situation now, we have huge discussion about Poland and the evolution in Poland. And if we want to be able to discuss about the rule of law everywhere in the world, it's maybe important to discuss, first of all, that inside the European Union. And I'm sure that it's maybe the same in the US. If we want to be able to discuss about the same values everywhere in multilateral fora, we need to deliver at home. And at the end, if we are so in favor of a multilateral approach, it's maybe due to that. It's peace and security, of course, is the first concern. It's development, but it's also to try to see if it's possible to have the same kind of reference, the same kind of values everywhere in the world. We are far from that, and it's maybe the good reason to go further with the real discussions between the US and Europe. But of course, to do that, we need to have both actors involved in the process. And so we will see if it's possible with the new US administration since some months now to work together in the same way.
Well, combine that, Congressman. I mean, he's talking about reforming the EU and expanding and strengthening institutions. But when we spoke earlier, you're talking about a current crisis in migration, current shifts in populations and again in power bases. Can people wait for the EU to reform, for NATO to come together, for the grand dream of some for United States of Europe to be as heavy a power center or a partner with America? Or are there other ways for these people who looked like you and like you more than they look like him to have the say, the effect, the power, the representation in the democracies that we're talking about?
In listening to all of the sessions and what people were talking about, last session they said, well, give us some words of hope. For me, and I make sure I mention race wherever I go, it makes people uncomfortable. But I think at times we need to be uncomfortable so that we can talk about real issues. And I would hope, and that's what I think is great about this room and everyone else, because you've got people who are foreign ministers and heads of states, and you got people from every day. You got some young people that are here from America and from other places in Europe that they're participating, and we're all having the opportunity. They have as much opportunity as anyone else to ask questions, which gives us the opportunity to listen. And that's what democracy does. So for me, no matter if you're on the bottom of the rink, a democracy gives you the hope that you can lift yourself up and make a difference. When you're living in a society, though, that is full of autocrats. There is not that hope. There never would have been an opportunity for me to do anything different. And that's why the EU and the values that we have is tremendously important. And then how do we do it together? It is important because I'm listening to all of the changing and energy. That's tremendously important. How do we pull it all together? Because it benefits everybody. Here's the opportunity that we have to do that. And so if the EU, and that's what, concerned me so much sometimes, and the reason why I bring it up when, people don't understand that in the United States, when I hear the President of the United States says, let's make America great again. Well, maybe that's, different people hear different things. But for me, when I hear let's make America great again, we're going back to the 50s and the 60s and the 40s. America wasn't great for me. So I take it, but I need to listen to someone else, because when I go to states like Ohio or Pennsylvania or Milwaukee, and I talk to people who are not like me, and I understand their concern about their jobs and they're having opportunity, it's the same thing as me. We're the same. And that democracy gives us the opportunity to make that change. And that is what brings us together in the EU and the United States. But if the EU is no longer together, and I think it's those who are authoritarians who would love to see the EU dissolve, that would give them the advantage. I think that's why Russia is putting so much pressure on the Baltics and other areas, because they would like to see the EU not together. And then you hear individuals within this populist movement in Europe, as I see it and hear it, they want to make people separate one another as opposed to finding those things that can help bring us together. And I think there are those characteristics that can bring us together because in my estimation, we are all one. We are all human. And that can bring us together as opposed to taking us apart. And we have differences and we can share and cherish and admire what those differences are. But let's not make them be clashes because in my estimation, and yes, I know we've got to defend ourselves and we got to have a strong military, but you can build walls, but people will build up and a wall will fall. I've seen it. I've seen the President of the United States tell the people, tear this wall down. So you can build them, but they're not going to stay up unless you put in process something that's going to keep the people in a situation where they feel that they can prosper from it.
Well, trying to pick up off of that. He's good, isn't he? So let's keep talking about the people, I think, more maybe perhaps other than the institutions, because that's a theme we've heard all week long. About about changing demographics and the rise of the women's movement, and the racial questions coming up now. But we in this room, at least from between last year and this year, to me, this is not the populist crowd. You guys are global, internationalists. You're pretty multilateralists. You guys are already there, but it's the populists who are on the rise, and it's the Trumpists who are on the rise and who have the power in the White House now, and they're the ones who say, good. We're looking for an authoritarian leader, not just on the right, but on the left too. There's a movement there that wants it. Are they just flat out wrong to want that, to want something different? Because the system that gave you all the good things that you said, and Dev gave you the same opportunities and what are business opportunities, or even tariffs as an issue, this week. So everyone's against tariffs, but the same people who elected the guy who wants to, put the tariffs, they love it. They said no. The problem is what everything that's been going on in the last 50 years. That's been bad for us. So are they just flat out wrong? What do you think?
So I think the nature of business is such that we've seen, from my vantage point as a businessman, the extraordinary force of globalization, which actually in version 1 was about investments. Capital moved from one part to another part of the world. I think what you're seeing today, and rightly so, are nation states basically saying, well, if you're going to develop an industry in my nation, then I want you to actually develop the supply chain, the capabilities, the managerial capacity in my nation state as well. So I think what you're seeing is, frankly, a move away from the mercantilist model to a model that is a lot more inclusive. So as I look at our own business, the demands when we go into a country isn't just about paying tax and royalties. It's about how do you deploy the supply chain? How do you create in Azerbaijan, as we have done, along with other investors, a supply chain that now has a capacity to actually provide their services around the world? How do you actually create in Angola capacity in terms of the legal system to deal with contracts that essentially are an essential component of fresh investments? So I think you're seeing, what is called sort of localization is not localization because it's got a somewhat pejorative connotation. What it is actually capacity building, which is more than just financial capacity, it's human capacity.
Well, what you're talking about, giving power to some of these countries like Angola, Congressman, you had a simpler version of how to say this, of the age of colonization, basically. And what's happening now?
Well, what I just simply said to you when we had our private conversation, I told you I wasn't going to say this here, but I will.
You didn't say that.
I said that when you talk about colonization and what's taking place here is somewhat the chickens coming home to roost. Because when you look at colonization, the problems that we're having in the world right now, whether it's the Middle East or Africa, these are all places that were colonized that dictators or somebody was put in place for our self-interest, that we didn't put, there was not any real form of democracy that was put in place and that we insisted on, the values that we wanted to live by. We allowed and supported dictators to suppress and fight their own people. In fact, we encouraged the minority to get squashed by the majority and to make sure that they were not on equal turf. And now it's not like it was 500 years ago. So you can't expect everything to change in 50, 60 years. So that turbulence is coming all up to the surface.
Yeah.
And so some of those same people want to now come to the United States of America and to Europe because they look at us for democratization and for hope and opportunity. And I think it is important for us to deliver on that, understanding what I'm hearing about, because it's not just about government, it's the business sector too. We've got to get people, because the business sector have a huge part to play in this. But the business sector has to be also inclusive too. So it hurts me at times when I am in the United States and I hear some of my Democratic colleagues wanting to watch, just close down Wall Street and get rid of capitalism and everything else of that nature. That's not the answer to me. The answer is open the door so everybody has an opportunity to participate and to be on a board of directors or to be,
Right.
So that's what the answer is.
Well, good. Thank you for indulging me by bringing that up. And I wanted that to be brought into the conversation as a reminder, again, of that, Bob Kagan introduction of this is a, relatively short-lived world order that we're in still. And it has a history that's still fresh in a lot of people's minds. So we're at, I think, about a quarter of an hour left and get some questions from the field, what you've been thinking about. And again, it doesn't have to be about what we've talked about. Give us something new. But Steve Clemens always has something to say. Usually it's pretty good. Stand up and
Steve Clemens
introduce yourself.
For Mr. Enders, we had a
Please.
conversation last year, in fact, here, and what had been part very much of Brussels Forum 2 years ago was a discussion of radicalized citizens within our societies and domestic terrorism, which has hardly come up this year. And I remember 2 years ago, we had the Brussels airport bombing the Sunday after the forum, the firefight last year while the forum was going on. So I'm interested in whether we're just lucky this year or whether you've done anything specific to deal with it, because I think there's a kind of, in my view, there's sort of a neglect of the topic, not purposefully, but because it's not happening, no one's talking about it. So I'd like to know how you've either solved the problem or whether we're just living off fumes of the fact that nothing's really happening right now on the domestic terror side.
Thank you. Good question. Tell us about, let's talk terrorism, let's talk security.
To solve the problem, it's maybe too much to say, but we have taken a lot of initiatives. Of course, at the international level, it's interesting to see that it was a multilateral approach with a coalition against some terrorist groups in Syria or in Iraq, and you have seen on the field, Daesh is gone. So it's possible to have a real success on the field against some terrorist groups. That's the first element. The second element, we have tried to enhance the capacity to exchange informations. It's not so easy. It's maybe the reason why we are speaking about Secret Service. So they don't like to share. They collect information, but they don't like to share. On terror, it's possible now. And we have more and more exchange of informations in the European Union, but also with the US, in the NATO, with many partners. And due to that, it was possible also to have better indication about those guys having maybe some intentions to organize some terrorist activities also in Europe. The third element is the way to protect the population. And so we have seen that maybe in the last 2 years, we have had huge presence in the streets, not only from police people, from the military people. Now we are going down because we have not only the feeling with some information that there are less risks, but there are some risks. We have very high level of attention on that. So again, if we want to go further, if we want to have a next forum without any terrorist attack, it's very important to stay with a multilateral approach in such an issue. It's a global challenge. We have seen, just to give a last example, so many foreign fighters leaving Belgium, 500, going to Syria and Iraq. But we have seen foreign fighters from everywhere in the world, and they are going back now to Europe, but it's going back to Malaysia, to the US, to others. And so that's a good reason to explain that the globalization in such a field is a good thing. And just to add it, I fully understand the way to imagine the world in the future, but there are many fears for many people about the globalization now. I've seen that during the discussions about the TTIP, the people were in the streets, and I want to say that as sort of the business community, they are sure that it's just a good thing for the multinationals, not for the SMEs, but not for the citizens. And now we are not in the TTIP. We are with some protectionist measures coming from the US for security reasons. So again, if you compare, we have made some huge progress in the fight against terror due to a real multilateral approach. And in other fields now, we are maybe in more difficulties.
Well, and that's a good reminder. It reminds me of, we haven't talked about the politics on top of all of this and what it matters. Ambassador Wendy Sherman brought that up in an earlier session that we had. Yeah. And the politics of security and how security and conflict has caused some of these upheavals and is giving questions. Can I call on you to weigh into this? We have David Ignatius here. One of our preeminent writers and followers of foreign policy and security policy. What I noticed, if you look around this room, how many military uniforms do you see around here? But almost every conference, every session has talked about ISIS or nuclear war or migration and refugee crisis, which are products of conflict like the Syria outcome. What are your impressions out here of this upheaval?
Just make a brief comment. Through these 3 days, I'm reminded of the top-level frictions between the U.S. and its transatlantic partners. They're as intense as I can ever remember them, and they're deeply worrying to a lot of us. But this conference reminds me of the bedrock links between people, leaders. I think it's one of the things that I want to thank Karen and GMF for doing, is maintaining that ground of transatlantic dialogue and shared values. This is a period in which we really need that. And so I'm glad to be at the Brussels Forum and remember everything we have in common.
Thank you. And yes.
I just want to follow one thing what you just said, which I think is tremendously important, is fear. And that's what I think the problem is. When I say we're all one, when we are afraid, people generally react the same way. And I think that people are voting in our democratic processes right now based upon their fear. And when you vote based upon your fear, you're not voting or thinking or moving based upon what should happen, because your fear overcomes all of that. And that is something that we've got to figure out how to deal with and to resolve, because fear is very much, I think, felt all over this world right now. People are fearful of the world of which they're currently living in.
Yeah, just to say that maybe for our next meeting, GMF, I don't know, but when we speak about terror and maybe security issues, we are also speaking about radicalization. And of course, for the moment, we are all thinking about one religion and the radicalization in one religion due to Daesh and ISIS and Boko Haram and others. But we have seen in the past some radicalizations about one ideology. And when you look to some processes in different countries with so many far-right parties or so many far-left also, we have maybe a necessity to think about the way to stop the radicalization in different fields. And maybe it's an interesting discussion between the US and Europe to think about that. Because for the moment, we are just focused on one religion. It's easy. We are all saying there are some extremists and some radicalized people in those kind of groups. But in the ideologies, it's also possible to see that. And so, to answer to your question again, we have taken a lot of measures, but on a long-term perspective, the fight against all those kind of radicalizations is the most important thing if we want to live in a sort of security atmosphere.
Okay, we're going to go to some more audience questions back here. I saw this woman's hand. We have another mic. Thank you.
Rebecca Thompson from the United States. This question is for Congressman Meek. While many of the people in this room would probably identify ourselves as global citizens, many of the people in our communities will never leave their neighborhoods. And so I'm curious, how do we build bridges amongst ordinary citizens so that they can understand that we have more in common than we think and actually learn from each other?
Great question. And I think that's more of an issue for us in the United States than it is in Europe, because as you say, in your headlines here in Europe, you'll see them talking about the United States, and I find when I travel here in Europe, I can get in a car with a taxi driver, I can talk to a person no matter where they are, and they are talking about globalization and world, whereas in the United States now we're trying to become more isolated and there's nobody exists between us. My hope on that is you. I think that it is the young people in the United States that, because in your world, with technology, et cetera, you can get all around the world. You know, I told you in another place that when my parents were growing up, it took them 12 hours to drive from South Carolina to New York as our system transformed from an agricultural society where you didn't need as many people in the field of agriculture, but to manufacture. Now you can fly 12 hours and you can be almost any place in the world. But that's your world. And so it becomes important for you to make sure that you are talking to your peers and spreading that. I also indicated the biggest regret that I have, if I could go back, is that I only speak English. As opposed to saying, as we have been saying in the United States, that you got to speak English if you want to be a citizen, and that's the only thing. We should be saying, as members of the United States, we want to speak multiple languages like every place else in the world. So my generation is too old to do that, and that's why your leadership to come take our place has to come in and do just that. And then the question is, and again, I could agree with you more. I had wrote, and I didn't say it, but you indicated, in our politics today, is there room for moderates? Because you have the extremes that seem like they're taken over. The extreme left or the extreme right. Is there room for moderates? I think that's the question that we've got to ask. Because if there's not any room for moderates, we're all in trouble.
Good. We're within our last, we're within the 5-minute window, and we are going to have a final question and a wrap-up, but we have our, the great representative from Great Britain here, Nick Going, please.
There are others from Great Britain.
Well.
I just want to pick up what David picked up and what Steve picked up as well. I'm troubled still that leadership is in trouble. And I remember 2 years ago, Kristalina Georgieva and also Karim El-Ayouni sitting on there when the platform was in a different place, warning about this. And I think there's still a massive trouble and struggle that's going on. And I pick up what Norbert Röttgen said as well earlier about stuck in old patterns, people at the top stuck in old patterns. What Ian Conn said yesterday from Centrica as well, what Federica Mogherini said about the result in Italy, and what we've seen in other parts of Europe as well. And it picks up Bob Kagan's first remarks, which is that we're about to go backwards into where we didn't think we'd be going again. And I think a challenge for the forum at the moment is how to embrace that. It's about when Norbert Röttgen sits there and says, we are stuck in old patterns. That was clear in Berlin, in Germany, before September, before the election. But it's now taking shock to realize that leadership has to change the way it thinks, whether corporate or in the public service.
If I
respond?
The first problem that we have had is the Brexit. So, of course, about the leadership, it was maybe the first difficult issue to see that it was impossible to remain in the European Union. But, well, it's a choice, so now we are trying to organize a smooth process with UK. But inside the European Union, now it's a challenge, of course. We have received, I said, many signals during the different elections, and now with the possible governments that we have, it's time to move on different issues. And if it's not the case, in the next elections, we will have more and more populist parties taking the place. And so with the new president in France, for the first time in France, we have had a candidate and now a president speaking positively about Europe. It's quite impressive. In Germany, there's a big coalition it may be possible to go further. So it's time. We have some months before the next European elections, and in 1 year time, it's the moment to try to make some real progresses inside the European Union. But I regret that it was impossible to do the job with UK, so we will try to do that with the 27 member states, or if it's needed, with some groups in the 27, like we have organized with the Eurozone and with others. But it's true, it's a challenging time. It's not enough to have a smooth process with a new government in Germany after some months of negotiations, maybe later in Italy, we'll see. It's time to take some decisions. And without that, I'm afraid about the next elections in Europe.
We have our own elections too this year, so there'll be some measurements.
I'm speaking about the European election of next year, but also the next presidential election in France, the next German election, so not now, in some years.
Right.
But if we don't deliver for the moment about the economic and monetary union, I said, so to go further in the deepening of our common action on social side, on fiscal side,
right.
If we don't have the capacity to solve the migration issue, but also to do more in defense and security, like I said, we will have more and more problems. We need to prove that there's a sort of European dream, and there's a possibility to, like for the globalization, to prove to the citizens that's a good thing. For the moment, there are many skepticism about the European process.
Right.
And so if we don't deliver in some fields, we will have more and more negative reactions against the European
common
process.
refrain all week long is that, if that's what you want, you need to do a better job of selling it, and let's see how it plays out in the elections. We're near the end. I want to ask for some final remarks, but before I do, I wanted to set up our final question. If you could get the phones out again, you can do some voting while people are talking, but we'll let them maybe bring that up on the screen. While they're bringing that up, think about that word cloud. The big words that I remember seeing, two of them were China and Russia, which we haven't spoke as much about. We talked about the people and about issues. So think about that in your final remarks, perhaps, go back to the geopolitics. That's what this is really about. And where are we heading? And as Karen in the forum has asked us, what needs to be done? What are your action items for everyone? For the audience, there's your question. After everything you've heard, are you hopeful for the future? Do you have hope? It was in the last session, hope.
I hope so.
It's a good word. Yes? Kind of? Or no? Those are the three that I picked. Tell me what you think. Why don't we start, Dev, with you? Because you in our pre-talk, you mentioned a little bit about the shift from Middle East to China, and the more traditional sense of power structure changing.
I think there are two real dimensions of the power structure.
And your action
changing.
items, what do you want?
Number one, as you think about sort of the Middle East and its sort of, if you will, relationship symbiotically with the West because of the way oil was flowing, and now when you look forward, the relationship between the Middle East and the East, because that's where the demand is a big shift. And that actually is something that we need to be thoughtful about, because passage of hydrocarbons and energy from that part of the world to the East is becoming increasingly important. One aspect we haven't spoken about is also technology. And as we think about the narrative moving forward, jobs is going to be a very important part of the narrative. And I think there is a real issue around how do you start creating new capacity? How do you reskill in light of these great technological changes we're seeing?
So what do you want to happen?
I think there is something about having a clear mission in terms of companies, governments, and regulators thinking about how we can bring about the new skills required for the business of the future as opposed to the business of the past.
Some more common objectives, sure. Congressman?
Well, first, and I don't know what they do, I'll say I have hope. And that hope has always been invested because we have young people. When I think about all of the major changes that we've had, it's always started because of young people. The American Revolution. Those were not old people that traveled from Europe to America. They were young. They wouldn't have been able to survive the journey. But they traveled because they didn't like the scenario in which they were living in, and so they came to a new world to create another one. They were young. When I think about directly the civil rights movement, and my colleague, for example, in Congress, John Lewis, he was 16 years old when we talk about this. When he was beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, he was 20. Dr. King, when he led the boycott, was 24. It's young people who gives me the hope. It's the same thing we look out in other parts of the world. The last session, I heard someone talking about North Korea, and the gentleman said, it's happening now. You don't see it because it takes time. When you're living it, you don't feel it, but suddenly you look back and things have changed because the camera of history continues to roll. It never stops. So I'm hopeful. And I think that the question of how we do adopt so that individuals can have a job and how we work with our companies. I look oftentimes what's taking place in Norway, and I was talking to some of the private businesses there where they were bringing young people on and older people whose jobs no longer exist and not saying we're going to just retrain you and you don't have a job. They say, no, we're keeping you here. We're going to retrain you and pay you along the way. Because when you get to be 50 years old and you've got a mortgage and you've got kids to you still need that income. So my hope is that we will adapt to the new world, the technological world. That's a new world that we live in, and it just takes that time to make that adjustment, but we will do it. I have no question about that.
Thank you, sir. Please, once again, he gets all the applause. And we'll close with our host. It's back to you. The poll is in. 56%, yes, they're hopeful. 33, kind of. That's not a no. I'll take it. That's pretty solid. And just 10% are not. And I'm not surprised in the last poll, if you recognize the answers about nuclear war in North Korea, there was a lot more fear at the beginning of the session. Talked it out for an hour, a little less fear. So you get the final word, sir. It's your country. We are your guests.
I will try to don't change the result with some last remarks. Just to say that, of course, I'm also very positive because if it's not the case, I need to change my job to another one. But I fully agree that there are a lot of challenges and that we need maybe to ask to the young generation to deliver on that maybe in the future. But now we are working with the actual leaders. And so it's also our duty to try to convince some leaders that it's possible to do more together. It's the reason why I'm very proud to have here in Brussels such a meeting. Thank you, Aaron, to do that, because the transatlantic relation is very important. We have started speaking about the values. If we want to go back to the values, it's important to discuss between both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. And to do that, it's very important to have an open dialogue. And I want to just to take 1 minute to give an example.
1 minute.
1 minute. Just the last decision about trade. For what kind of reason is explaining? National security. We are in the same NATO alliance. We are sharing the same values. What is the risk if Belgium is exporting a small part of its steel production to the US? So is it possible to explain it? Is it possible to restart a real dialogue? And then to show that we have many things to do together, like in security field, like in others. If it's not, we will continue to have an open dialogue and we will continue maybe with some members of the Congress to try to do the job. But we need, of course, to discuss with the young generation, but it's also a good moment to try to convince the actual leaders that it's the moment to deliver, and I said about the globalization, to deliver not only for the multinationals, but in the mind of the citizens, we need to be sure that it's possible to think that it's also positive for the SMEs and for the job creation. Without that, I've had that in Belgium. You know, there may be that, but we have had a long discussions about the CETA, the negotiation with Canada. It was very difficult to convince the people that free trade with Canada, it's a positive element. I will go tomorrow to Canada with our king and our queen, and we'll try again to explain it. So we need all the time to try to convince the actual leaders and maybe to ask to the young generation to do the job later. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, before we wrap up, Richard's going to come back out and give us a little final wrap, so please stay in your seats. But please, a round of applause for our esteemed guests today and for Karen and the GMF for a wonderful week and a good session. Thank you for your attention. Richard, there you are.
Kevin, stay seated. Right where at. Stay seated. Go sit down. All of you don't move. Can you believe we are now at the end of the 13th Brussels Forum? It's been an action-packed 3 days. And I want to build on that very idea, though, of looking to youth. Congressman Meeks, who brought up that idea, that not necessarily unique, but we understand it. And we have the Young Professional Summit that starts the Brussels Forum every year. We started discussing what these new policy thinkers and workers want to do come next week. And I want to go back to them now. Those who are here, who's a YPSer, stand up, stand up. Yeah. I want to get your thought. What are you going to do next week in 15 seconds?
I'll head back to Charlottesville, Virginia, and inform my friends that the fight against white supremacy and white nationalism is not just domestic, it's global. So we have to build relationships with our friends across the pond.
Revise, reboot, rebuild. What's your reflection on what you're going to do next week?
Next week, I'll continue building our network and your network together. Meanwhile, the older generation is infighting in between. The youth will fix this problem for you.
15 seconds.
Go back to London and encourage more young people to change the world.
This is, we can listen to this all day, can't we? Let me run over here really fast.
We are living in challenging times, and as Congressman said, we are all one, so we need to come together and make the world a better place.
Amen.
Come back to Italy and work for more inclusion in my community.
That's great. I'm just going to hit this side really quickly. I'm looking at you.
Yeah, I'm going to stay in Brussels because I actually work here. And then I'm going to write a blog post about free trade, and so maybe the minister can read it.
Fantastic.
It helped me to open my mind and to understand better the events in past years and months. So I hope it will even more inspire me.
15 seconds. What are you going to do next week different?
Running for elections. I will be the first Roma candidate for elections in Albania.
Hey! And I did not plant that. But if I could have, I would have, right? Thank you, all of you young professionals who are now going to make a big difference when it comes to policy in transatlanticism. Now I want to go to our moderators to get their perspective, because they sat here through all of this with all of you and have been reflecting. I know, because I've spoken to many of you throughout the last 3 days. I want to get your 15 seconds on what do you think is different, what can be actionable coming next week. So please, if you all can stand, all the moderators. Oh, Kim, you're here. Okay.
So, more awkward moments. When we had those moments of truth and disagreement between Trump administration officials who came here and defended their positions, and you got both industry and politicians speaking honestly, but politely. We need more of that, because there's too much complaining off aside to each other in our little groups and not enough communication. And it's only through the communication that we're going to break down some of these divides that are really worrying me, and I know a lot of people in this room.
Fantastic. Ugly food, I think is what she was saying. Ugly food. Since you happen to be standing here, Kevin?
The same thing, but I'll extend it to that comment I made about the military. I'm dismayed that there's no military here, but I know the feeling. I also try to organize events. They won't come because of the Trump administration. They don't want to be asked about these things or asked about Trump's tweet of the morning and then be put on the spot because their military officers are not supposed to. But the fact that we've had one Trump administration person this week, or a handful, very small number, that's not GMS' fault. That's the administration's fault. We'd love to have more of that dialogue. I hope the administration will put those people out now that they're in place, and that can begin.
Great. Revise, reboot, rebuild. What are you going to do different, you think? What can folks do different next week that you've learned?
Well, as usual, Richard, I'm not going to answer your question.
No, you have to. I'm going to pull the microphone. See, I have the microphone. I can walk this way, but you have to answer.
No, but what I wanted to say was that for my session, we were supposed to talk about the intersectionality of all of these sectors. And what was beautiful about my particular session is that we almost immediately started talking about people. And the thing that I loved about my session is that no one had the answers, because the questions are still, they're rolling, they're ongoing. And so that's what I love about Brussels Forum, is that people are willing to say they don't know. but they're willing to try to find out the answer.
I don't know about that.
After the digital forum that we had, it was amazing the number of people who came up to me and said that things are much worse than got presented in the conversation between the digital single market minister and Susan Ness. And I think that what needs to be done as an action item is whether it's a track 2 or whether it's formal forums like this, more real discussions about how things are. I think there's a lot of concern about hate speech in the American digital platform and the inability or unwillingness of US firms to curtail that with alacrity. I think there's frustrations on privacy. I think Russia and meddling in the digital sphere is a possible unifying force transatlantically that maybe we need to take greater advantage of. But I think that candor, greater candor and greater realism is probably needed, and that will get us to a better place.
Thanks, Richard. I came away with 2 very strong feelings. One, we should keep faith with Ukraine, despite all its troubles. And 2, I think the period of the Trump benign neglect for Europe is over. I think with trade, with it threatens to put tariffs on cars, we're in a new space, and it's not a happy one.
David, you're sitting down, but I'm going to come to you anyway. Your takeaway, what would be different next week?
Well, I don't know that anything will be different next week, but I think we made a good start. What I loved about this Brussels Forum is that it reached out to new audiences. I love it when you call on the young professionals to stand up. As a German Marshall Fund trustee, that was a special moment.
You know, as I'm going to hand it over now to the Executive Vice President here, Derek Chalet, in just 2 seconds. But, you know, I started by saying ugly food, and that deconstruction of what policy is an opportunity, I think, as we look at what's moving forward. And I think that's a common thread that all of our moderators have talked about. I'm really excited when we come back for the 14th Brussels Forum about what actually happened based on what you just said and what you just heard, not only in closing, but throughout the last 3 days. So thanks for being here. To close us up, Derek Chalet, Executive Vice President.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you to our terrific moderators, because we could not have done this without such a masterclass of moderation that all of you have shown, as well as, of course, to the young professionals that are here. I think all of you deserve a round of applause. Moderators, young professionals. Look, as I reflect on the last 3 days and all the conversations we've had with one another here in this room, or at night owls, or over breakfast, or dinner, or coffee breaks, I really come back to where Bob Kagan kicked us off, where he reminded us that for the last 7 decades or so, we have lived in an extraordinary moment. And that moment was built by men and women who, as the Congressman has reminded us, may not be as old as we might remember they were. Young people who showed leadership, who showed a deep commitment to citizenship, who showed a generosity of spirit, who showed a willingness to make sacrifices, and a willingness at times when necessary to fight. And they were trying to revise, reboot, and rebuild their order. And that's the challenge for us today. For the German Marshall Fund, this is the core of our mission. And in our own modest way, we try in everything we do to revise, reboot, and rebuild. Whether that's in our leadership programs, most prominently perhaps the Marshall Memorial Fellowship, which brings together transatlantic leaders, Europeans to the United States, Americans to Europe, for intensive study periods where they can meet one another and learn about our common challenges. We are very proud that leaders like Federica Mogherini, who you heard here the other day, and as well as President Macron of France, are among the over 3,000 alumni of the Marshall Memorial Fellowship. But I believe strongly in ensuring that the future always has a seat at the table. And at the German Marshall Fund, we want to ensure that the future always has a seat in this room, which is why we are so proud and happy to have the folks from the Young Professional Summit here, and why we have our fellows who are part of the Transatlantic Inclusive Leadership Network here with us as active, full participants. So it's our leadership programs. It's, of course, the policy work that the German Marshall Fund does, whether it's trying to navigate the challenges of the future of NATO or European integration, to how we can make our cities and communities better, to the cutting edge issues like that my colleagues Laura Rosenberger and Jamie Fly have created over the last year, something that did not exist at the last Brussels Forum, the Alliance for Securing Democracy, which is an effort, as you saw in a presentation yesterday, to learn more, to understand, to expose the full toolkit that Russia and other countries use to try to undermine the very fabric of our democracies, and just as important, perhaps more important, for us to build common tools to push back and fight against those efforts. So we have leadership, we have policy, and of course, German Marshall Fund remains on the front line of trying to build strong democracies and strong civil societies, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, where democracy, where rule of law, and where human rights remain under threat. And then finally, it's forums like this. It's bringing people together, whether we're doing it here in Brussels, or we're in Washington, or Ankara, or Berlin, or Warsaw, or Paris, or Bucharest, or Belgrade, where our offices are, or, as has been a priority of ours for the last year, getting out into our communities, not just sitting in the capitals where we all of our capitals are their own bubbles, where we're getting out to talk directly to folks and engage directly with folks who are on their own front lines and dealing with the real challenges in their communities and the hardships that we've talked so much about today, and to try to learn from one another and to try to create new relationships and to try to get new ideas so we can revise, reboot, and rebuild for the future. So as a final word, I'd like to pass the baton to my friend, my boss, our leader, Karen Donfried.
So I was just flashing to the debate yesterday when Kori Schake was talked about as always wearing a tiara of optimism. And I might fall into that camp, so of course I answered the question that I was hopeful. But hearing all of this really makes me hopeful. And you know, we think about Brussels Forum, it's a conversation really that goes from year to year. And we wanted to focus on action this year. We started that last year. And I don't know if you all remember one of the young professionals from last year who was the mayor of Ithaca, New York, who was going to move a couch off the front porch of a house in Ithaca, New York that had been a blight in the neighborhood. And it might seem like a small thing, but it's about each of us taking action in our own space, and hearing all of you say what you were going to do, I think also gives us a charge for next year when we do come back to make sure that we've all stayed true to those pledges that we made today. And Derek ran through what we want to do at GMF in that same space. So I think we all leave here with a charge to action. And the other thing I want to do is just thank all of you in this room. I think there was an intensity to this Brussels Forum that maybe wasn't there in quite the same way last year. And it has to do with the period of history we're living in, has to do with a mix of people in this room. So the fact that it's so full as we conclude is just such a wonderful sign of that intensity. Now, I also want to thank our incredible partners who make this possible. And, you know, we have two founding partners, Daimler and the federal authorities of Belgium. And you have been with us for all 13 years, which is fantastic. We also have a strategic partner in Deloitte, and then we have that terrific group of forum, associate, and dinner partners. And so we really couldn't do this without those partnerships, which are both financial, but they're also substantive. And I want to give a shout out to the members of Congress who are here. Of course, Congressman Meeks is here on the floor. There are others scattered in the audience. We're so grateful that you helped create a diversity of voices here at Brussels Forum, and appreciate all of you taking the time. I also want to thank my incredible board. We had several trustees from GMF here, led so wonderfully by Mark Leland. David Ignatius called himself out as a member of the board, but they're also scattered through the audience, and they're key to what GMF does every day. And then, of course, the last and really most important thanks go to my colleagues, because Derek and I get to stand up here and have stand in the glory, but we are not the ones who actually make this happen. And I see Nicola Leitner standing in the back. Please, Nicola, come on down. And there are lots of other folks who helped put this together. Ian is, of course, here on the ground in Brussels, together with the equally amazing Louise Langeby. But Nicola is the one who inspires every one of us at GMF who make this happen. So thank you, and hope everyone leaves with that concrete action that you're going to take. We'll hold you accountable next year. Thanks, everybody.